Yeah, maybe that's what I should try.
Yeah, well, we can just keep going this way if you'd like. Is this phone okay with you, and are you comfortable?
Yeah, this is fine.
All right. And okay. And again, for the live listener that's been hanging in there, thanks so much. It looks like I have to do a little bit of editing. I just saw your text. Robert, so can you tell the first time listener a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I live in Austin, Texas. My degree is in chemistry, and I spent most of my career, the last 30 years, in the semiconductor field. I was an engineering manager. I worked on flash memory chips, on microprocessor chips, and I also managed a state-of-the-art chemistry laboratory, as well as a state-of-the-art research and development laboratory. I retired early when I was in my 50s, and I went ahead and started doing the things I really enjoyed doing, one of which was to investigate the UFO phenomenon. So I've spent the last 10 years actually probably putting in 15 to 20 hours a week on that, just like it was a job.
Wow.
And I became the director of research at Mufon, and done a lot of interesting investigations in addition to personally interviewing probably over 150 people. I did the Stephenville Lights investigation back in 2008, and then recently I did a detailed investigation on Aguadilla, which was an IR video that occurred in Puerto Rico.
Right. I thought we could talk a little bit about that as well, along with this new group that you have started. But that one in particular, was there ever any consensus about what that, I know people were saying it was a balloon, you heard everything, but was there ever any consensus of what that may end up being, or is that still an unknown?
It's still an unknown. People have advanced various theories, right, such as a balloon. I think the better theory would be some type of advanced drone, but there's a few problems with that theory.
Right, when it goes into the water.
Pardon?
When it goes into the water, that's a little tough for a drone these days.
Right. But what really makes it difficult is for a drone to come out of the water at high speed.
Yeah.
We researched that, and there are some drones that can enter the water and move through the water at a good speed.
Right,
but
from?
They can't.
Can they do that right from the air, or do they have?
Yeah.
Is it really? Isn't that something?
Boeing actually has developed a drone that flies like an airplane, and then it blows its wings off right before it impacts the water, and then it goes into the water like a torpedo, and it maintains fairly high velocity underwater. The problem is though that drone can't come back out of the water.
Yeah.
And that's what happens on the video, that we looked at. Some people argue that maybe it didn't really go in the water, but they have yet to advance a strong argument as to why this object would not have actually been in the water, but it's just an image issue. Because there are times where the image is crystal clear and disappears and it comes back crystal clear. So that's not indicative of a video system that is at its limit of capabilities, and then you suddenly lose the object, because then you wouldn't have it come back and as a clear object again.
Now, I have taken a look at that video myself, very interesting, and one of the, my first, or a thought I had at one time was a balloon, but I understand there was all types of maneuvers where that wouldn't really fit in, and also the question I have, do I recall that either splits into two objects, or was that some type of reflection?
No, it splits into two objects. We cannot explain that as a reflection. So so they're all of the debunkers are always trying to come up with some type of theory, right? They never really put out a full report and explain the video from beginning to end, but they try to look at pieces of it. So one theory was, maybe it's a pair of Chinese lanterns that were tied together, and then they tore apart, right, after they disappeared in the water. And then, of course, they have to say, well, they didn't really go in the water in order to make that argument. But probably the biggest problem with the Chinese lantern is that in order to meet the balloon theory requirements, these lanterns would have to move at 20 to 25 miles per hour. And the problem there is a Chinese lantern won't survive at speeds much above 5 miles per hour.
You mean it'll just tear apart, basically?
Right. Yeah, they will basically collapse because all it is a candle that's inside a very lightweight envelope.
Like a paper, yeah.
Right, and it's just pushing hot air to the top, and so that makes it rise. Well, if the wind impacts the side of it and collapses it, you no longer are lighter than air, and so then it quickly drops. So there's no way this could have been, Chinese lanterns.
Now, has anyone...
So there's no good explanation so far.
Yeah. Has anyone I know that there were some people on the team that were looking at this seriously that really wanted to remain anonymous. And those were people of, basic science, if I remember right. Is that true?
Well, the guys who wrote the report, is myself. I have a science background. Carl, and I can't recall Carl's last name all of a sudden, Carl Paulson. And Carl's degrees in physics, he got his physics degree at New York University, and then he worked at Princeton laboratories. He worked for Lockheed, very intelligent guy. So he was a key person in the analysis. And then a guy by the name of Larry Cates, who is his degrees in mathematics, and he did a lot of the statistical work on it, as well as, just a lot of the calculations. And then Morgan Beale, whose background is in earth sciences. And then, of course, Richard Hoffman, who works at the Army Material Command. And he's an engineer there. So those were the main guys that worked on it. We also had, as soon as we released the report, we had I guess what you might call an IR technician contact us because he worked on those exact same video systems. This was the MX-15, and he worked on them in Puerto Rico. He said he may have worked on the exact unit that took the photo. He doesn't know, but he was very familiar with them, and he showed these videos to the other technicians in their lab, and they said, they couldn't identify what it was.
Now,
their comment was what was so unique to them was that the object was so easy to see. That was, to them, what was unique about it.
I see. Now, can you remind me, because it's just been a while since I looked at this, was there actually radar data as well?
Yes. We obtained radar data from the FAA. And the radar data does not pick up the object as the plane is videoing it. What the radar data did pick up, though, is it detected an unknown object in the same area that this object came towards Puerto Rico from just northwest of the island, about 2 miles offshore. So radar picks up an unusual object approaching Puerto Rico. And what was unusual also was that the radar was basically scanning every 10 seconds. And so instead of seeing an object that's moving in a straight line, there was an object without a transponder, right? So that means it's primary radar. and it's just jumping around. It's moving in a general direction. And I never could figure out, I said, that's just really strange. It just doesn't make any sense why it would do that. I mean, the only thing I could say for certain was there was some unknown in that area, but I could not explain, why this seemingly random movement. And when I say random, it's moving in a direction, but it's hopscotching around as it moves in that direction. And we sent a copy of the report to the French group, Sigma 3AF, which is a group of French scientists that at one time were part of, CNES and their programs. And they brought up a good point, and then I researched it and said, yeah, I guess they've got a good point here. That's very typical of an object that's jamming a radar signal.
Really?
If you see the object, and you can jam radar signals in different ways, and the way I suspect this was occurring, and this is just purely a hypothetical guess, right, is that the object may have had a plasma around it, and plasmas will cause a radar beam to skip and jump. So that's just my guess. But that was very interesting. That, what are the odds that we would pick up this unknown object right before this object approaches Puerto Rico?
That's really
and
bizarre.
And the reason we think, that it disappeared off radar, once it came over the island, was I calculated the distance that the radar could still detect the object based on altitude. And once the object would drop below about 400 feet, it would drop below radar. So that was the theory, is that it was probably above 400 feet, it was picked up on radar. Then once it dropped below 400 feet, then you can't see it on radar anymore.
Wow. That is, that is quite a case. And it's something, when something like this happens, it just seems to go so far, and then it kind of, I don't know, fades away. Do you feel that way? Like people stop talking about it, and there's never a conclusion.
Right. Yeah, that's that's the problem in ufology, right? Is that there's no organization that continually follows all of these together. Like a government type organization. And it's you hear unless you have a spaceship that lands or something hard and concrete that you can grab, people lose interest, and they just jump from one story to the next without really looking at, okay, where are the really important cases versus just lights in the sky, for example. Right.
And that I think in general society has changed in that way, and I think it has to do with just all the information coming at us in all different ways all the time.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Like, I monitored this a little bit on YouTube, and on YouTube you can see how long the average person looks at the video.
Yeah.
I mean, the average person didn't look at the video for more than, probably 40, I think it was around 40, 45 seconds.
Isn't that amazing?
So most people, they never even saw the object split. They never saw the object go into the water because they turned it off before it ever got there.
Yeah. It really takes something to keep someone's attention, and I do understand that. I mean, I can't even get through my email. It's something. So let's talk. That case is really fascinating to me, and if there's ever any chance there's an update, I'd love to know. I'd love to know about that. Let's talk a little bit about the new organization that it just was founded recently, not too long ago, right? SCU?
That's correct. We created it in August, Scientific Coalition for Ufology, which we just call SCU. And it's done real well. I mean, the basic concept is that we want people with either law enforcement, investigative type backgrounds, or science backgrounds. And so currently we have 35 members, and of those 35 members, 9 members have PhDs. 92% of all the members have college degrees. And then we have a board that kind of reviews the resumes of any individuals interested in joining, and we pretty much try to avoid bringing in anyone who has kind of a non-scientific view of the phenomenon. So, so we've got within the group, we've got like PhDs in a PhD in oceanography, a PhD in physics, PhD in psychology, and then we've got master's and bachelor's degrees in electrical engineering, chemistry, physics, all of the major sciences, PhD in biochemistry. So that tells you that there's a lot of scientists who are interested in this phenomenon if it's investigated in a serious manner.
And that is your attempt. That is your mission statement, is investigating these. Now, so who decides the cases that you're going to choose to investigate?
Well, the way we're currently set up, we actually have not gotten to the point yet of investigating a specific case. I mean, other than the Aguadilla, Puerto Rico case, right, which was the very first case that we did. But that was before we created the organization. So now, anytime we find a case that looks like it has hard evidence, then we will collect a group of individuals and we will investigate the case. But I would say on average, you only usually have 1 or 2 good cases a year. And by a good case, I mean a case that you either have a lot of witnesses or you have some type of strong photograph or video, something that can be analyzed, kind of like the Stephenville case or the Aguadilla case. Something that you can kind of sink your teeth into it.
Yes, we were talking back when both of our internets were working. We were talking ahead of the show about how elusive, UFOs are, and how, if you're doing scientific research, how difficult it is to do. It's not replicable.
Right. It's not like you can sit out someplace and say, okay, I know there will be a UFO show up here today. It's on the schedule. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I think Bob Lazar would argue with you on that one.
Oh, yeah. He would probably say, there's a place you can go and see them all the time.
Yeah, well, yeah. So now, the website address, let's just give that out real quickly.
Yeah, that is it's www.scu.org.
Oh, okay. I think I might have a different website up. I'll have to check that out. So I wish you luck. I hope you
may have it.
Go ahead.
I think you're right. I'm sorry, Martin. You're right. It's explorescu.org.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. So let's hope some really good cases. I see you can actually report a case there as well. And also, let's talk quickly about UFODATA, because that is another organization you're involved in, and that's got to be, 3 years old or 2 years old now?
Yeah, UFODATA is 3 years old. I'm not as actively involved in that organization, but I'm part of the organization. Its basic mission is to develop basically an optical system that takes spectra of lights at night so that you can analyze the photo. And the system that's been developed so far actually takes 2 images. One's an optical image, and then the other's a spectra. The most difficult part that the UFODATA group has run into is basically the software issues that surround when, how a camera recognizes an object, right, and without being confused by a falling leaf or movements in the clouds, insects that go by, those kind of things. So that's the most difficult part of developing the system.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of algorithm writing to get around all that.
Right.
A lot of development to get something like that going. So let's talk about the Nimitz case, which is another fascinating case. The first I know people were talking about it before, but the first I heard about it is when Chris Mellon talked about it. But how long have you been researching that case in particular?
Well, I actually first found out about this case in July of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an interesting story because when I found out about it, it wasn't really out there in the UFO world per se. I think there had been something that cropped up in around the year 2007 on a website called Above Top Secret.
Oh yeah.
But that was all. That was all there was, and there wasn't much about the case at that point in time. But in mid-2016, a gentleman that I've known for a number of years, who is not in the mainstream ufology world, but I know that he works with the government, and he has done work for organizations related to UFOs in the government. Now, I was meeting with him, and he was, we were talking about the Aguadilla case. And so he said, well, I've got an interesting case that you might want to hear a little bit about. And he had a folder that was a half-inch thick on this case. But he wouldn't let me see the folder, but he told me some things about the case. And then he said, but by the way, someone has leaked it to the Internet. So if you want to do a little Googling, you won't have any problem finding it. And so that's what I proceeded to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I found the magazine article by a former Navy colonel. His name's Paco. If I can pronounce his last name correctly, I think it's something like Chikari or something like that. But probably a number of your listeners may have seen this website. So I found the website. So what attracted me to it was not a typical UFO website, right? This was actually on a Navy blog. And so I looked at the writers' other blogs, right? And they're all about Navy items. This is his only write-up on a UFO. And he's using Navy lingo through the whole thing. He takes time in the beginning to say, this is pretty crazy, and so I'm going to start off by telling you how strong the witnesses are in terms of their credibility. And so he goes through that. And so as soon as I read that, I said, okay, this is a legitimate case. This is not, just some wild case out there. So the first thing I had to do was go look up all the Navy lingo so that I could understand exactly what these guys were saying happened. And so once I did that, the next step was in late December of 2016, I sent out, I think about 11 FOIAs. And I think all total now I've sent out 13 FOIAs. So I sent them out to every different Navy organization to find out information, because it's probably good at this point that I tell your audience kind of what basically happened. So there's a U.S. Naval group out about 70 miles west of San Diego. It's November of 2004. And they have been, the USS Princeton, which is a missile frigate, had one of the top radar systems of that time, which was called a Spy-1 radar system. And they'd been detecting an object apparently for several days that would be up at 80,000 feet, and then it would be down to, 50 feet to 100 feet above the ocean floor. And so on this particular day, I'm not sure what motivated them to do this, but the Princeton picks these two objects up, or one, I'm not sure if it's one or two objects. They pick them up on radar, and they call in a Marine F-18. It's a Lieutenant Colonel Kurtz, who also happened to be the commanding officer of an entire Marine squadron. So they give him the coordinates, and he's flying to the coordinates. Before he gets there, the Princeton radios him and tells him to break off because they're sending two Navy Super Hornets, which is just, a more advanced F-18, to the target. But since he's in the area, he goes ahead and flies by, and he never sees the targets, but he sees this huge bubbling area in the ocean, which to him, the best explanation is like a ship that has just sunk.
Mm.
Because he says the water is glassy clear that day, except for this one area. So he breaks off and goes from the area, and then the other two F-18s, who the commander of the group, which is called the Black Aces off of the USS Nimitz, the commander's last name is Fravor. He's headed there with his wing guy, and as they approach, they don't see anything on radar, but once they get close enough and get to the target, they see the target that the USS Princeton has vectored them to them. And what they see is basically, he describes it as a tic-tac. So it's basically, like those candies.
Mm-hmm.
It's an oval-type object. And the commander believes the tic-tac is, he said, there's no wings, there's no method of propulsion, it's just there in the sky. But then it turns its nose towards him. And when it does that, he assumes that that's an aggressive move. And so one of the F-18s, I think, changes to a different altitude, and then his F-18 engages the object. Now, he doesn't have any weaponry on board. He's just, I guess, doing his standard maneuvers, which, I'm not familiar with those, not being in the Navy. But my understanding is what happens is he's trying to do a maneuver so he gets behind the object. And the object actually gets behind him. And so he's never able to do that, and he does various maneuvers, and then finally this object just takes off and leaves. So he and the other F-18, they're not able to match that speed, so they just head back to the Nimitz. As they're heading back to the Nimitz, the USS Princeton calls them and says, "You'll never guess, but the object is back at its same cap." And cap just means that's its location where it was first found by the USS Princeton. And so the commander says, "Well, we're low on fuel now. We cannot, turn back around and go back there." So they proceed to the Nimitz, and the Nimitz sends two more F-18s to that target. And it's at this point it's not real clear if it was the first two F-18s or the second two F-18s that apparently took a video of the object. But I'm pretty sure it was the second pair of F-18s. And the story of what happens to them, and we don't have, because the guy who wrote the Navy blog was familiar with this Captain Fravor, not Captain, but the Commander Fravor, and Lieutenant Colonel Kurth, who was a commander of the Marine Squadron. So what his story basically is the story from those two officers, and we don't have the story of whoever, the two F-18s that went out later.
Now, when they flew over and they saw the bubbling in the water, were they assuming that the thing went underwater? And I heard you say early on that it was down to 100 feet above the ocean floor, so that means they were actually tracking it underwater?
Oh, no, okay, I'm sorry, 100 feet above the ocean surface.
Oh, the ocean surface, okay.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, just above the ocean surface. Now, the in the article that's written, the Marine Colonel doesn't draw any conclusions as to whether something, that this was the object he was going to find or anything. His only conclusion was the ocean water was crystal clear, much more calm than normal, except in this area where it looked like an object the size of a ship had just sunk.
Yeah.
Because of the turbulence in that area. But he did not know what caused it, or he didn't see anything that caused that. He only saw the water turbulence.
So do you think at this point that this, I know you did your FOIAs, and we can talk more about that, but at this point, is this case classified as far as you know?
Oh, you mean classified by the military?
Yes.
So far, in all of my FOIAs that have been denied, the Navy has never said that this information is classified, and that's why we can't send it to you. What they've said every time was that they just don't have the logs. And so basically what they've said is 5 different naval assets, right? The USS Nimitz, the USS Princeton, the Navy Squadron, the Marine F-18, and there was also what's called an E-2 Hawkeye, which is an airborne early warning aircraft that was in the area that also picked up the object on their radar. All 5 of those Navy assets, when I sent FOIAs, every time the response came back was that we have no information. We don't have those logs. We don't have anything. So they never used they never claimed classification or top secret. However, when I asked for the deck logs of the USS Princeton, I received that same reply that we don't have any deck logs. And a FOIA officer, because these FOIA officers that you send these requests to, they're not really in the business of trying to hide information from you. They're just, they're doing their clerical job.
Mm-hmm.
And this FOIA officer did say this to me. He said, that's very unusual that they can't give you the deck logs. And he said that it's so unlikely that they've lost the deck logs that it's more likely that they have classified it. And it's classified high enough that he's not even aware of the classification. So basically he's saying if it's classified, like top secret, for example, he's never, as a FOIA officer, he's never going to know that. All he's just going to hear is, we don't have those logs.
I thought that was, I thought that was kind of against the Freedom of Information Act, but maybe I just don't know enough about that. I thought that, so once something hits classified, that it's just pulled out of the loop, and you have to wait until after that changes, say, 25 years later or 50 years later or something?
Right, yeah. If it's classified, or if it's secret, or if it's top secret, they don't have to give you that information.
In other words, they don't even have to acknowledge that it exists at all.
I'm not sure if they have to acknowledge it exists at all, but I know it is a practice to just say it doesn't exist, does not exist, even though it does. Because I've done enough FOIAs, I just see that happen. Now, sometimes what I think happens also, Martin, is it's a lot of work for them to go find this information, right? And in some cases, they just say, hey, I don't want to mess with that. We don't have the data.
Or I've heard replies that we can't find it.
Right.
which sounds
And
even more suspicious.
that's actually what my appeal was. So, for example, when I appealed one of the FOIAs, the first appeal was just turned down. They just said, nope, we agree, because you're really appealing to the Navy just to a higher up. You're appealing to JAG, which is the Navy's basically their legal arm. And so they just said, no, we agree. They've done a reasonable search, and that's all they have to do is a reasonable search. And so then they give you the legal cases that support, what defines a reasonable search. So then I sent back a second appeal on another one of the FOIAs, and I noticed on the email it was the same JAG officers that were going to evaluate that one. So I sent them an additional email where I said, I understand your first argument, and there's some validity to that. I said, however, in this case, what I'm arguing is you've got 5 different Navy assets, right? And you're going to tell me that it's reasonable that you can't find documents on any of 5 Navy assets that were in a Navy exercise on that day? And so this time, after I sent that to them, they said, well, we'll take that into consideration. So I think they said, okay, we got to throw this guy a bone. So they sent me back a partial, this time they give me partial acceptance on my appeal. And they sent me some emails back. And I was really surprised that these guys sent me these emails. This email, the first one, and I open it up and I'm looking, and it's from Lieutenant Colonel. And they have sent, the JAG officers have asked him, have you ever heard of this case, blah, 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 right? His response is, oh, the Tic Tacs. Yeah, we know all about the Tic Tacs.
Wow.
And I'm just like, wow, so now they're admitting that this happened. And it's just a question of finding the logs. And another lieutenant colonel, this guy was a second guy. He was not a lieutenant colonel. He was a major. And he said, well, we don't have these documents because they're over 10 years old. And so they would be in the archives. And so then he writes in his email, I'm sure you could find a point of contact that could find the documents in the archives for Mr. Powell. And so, of course, I've sent them another appeal that I want them to go search the archives, because I think all they did initially is they just asked the squadrons, hey, do you have these documents from the year 2004? Well, no, they don't have documents. A squadron's not going to keep documents that old. So they never really went and looked in the archives. So that appeal is still outstanding. It's almost 2 months old now.
And I know.
So in my mind,
go ahead,
Mark. No doubt that this happened.
Yeah.
The event happened. My understanding is that there was the Navy Inspector General actually investigated the case, but I can't prove that. That's all hearsay from what I've heard so far.
So now I played up on YouTube. I played the video that it shows online. Is that authentic video? Do you know anything about that?
Okay, so I'm familiar with the video. We don't know for certain that is the video that was taken by the F-18s. What we do know is that the F-18s did take video, because in my FOIA reply, that's noted in the Lieutenant Colonel's email. He said, a lot of us saw the video. So apparently these guys got the video and they were playing it among the other, various officers on board the ship. So we know video exists. What I don't know for certain is the video that was released on the internet, and that video was actually released in 2007 on the internet. And so various people have made arguments about, maybe it's a fake video because it was released on a German media video type site, that makes movies and things. So whether or not that is the video, I can't say for certain. I actually suspect it is a copy of the original video, and the reason I say that is the altitude that's shown on the video, 20,000 feet, is the same altitude approximately that the commanding officer of the F-18 said they were at when they encountered the what he called the Tic Tacs. So I suspect that is, but we don't know for certain. And to me, what's the most important part about this case is not whether that video is the real video or not. To me, the important part of the case is that we've got testimony from Navy and Marine officers that this event happened, and those F-18s were sent off of the Nimitz to intercept this object, and the lead F-18, who was the commanding officer, engaged the object with his aircraft. So, to me, that eliminates just about everything. And my view is, I just want to know, why can't the Navy just tell us what they know? I don't understand their need to hide that information.
Yeah, it's probably up above them. Who knows? So, did you actually speak to the witnesses, or was there, was it communication in through email, or how? What happened in that when it comes to the witnesses?
Okay, so the witnesses, I have not been in communication with any of the witnesses. I do know an individual who contacted me and actually made communication with Lieutenant Colonel Kurth. And remember, he was the Marine who was in the first F-18, that all he saw was the water disturbance. Well, so he called Lieutenant Colonel Kurth, and he said that it was very polite conversation. He said the gentleman spoke very slowly, very distinctly, and he was very confident in everything he said. And he said that, this is interesting. The first thing he found out was that Lieutenant Colonel Kurth actually worked for Bigelow after he left the service. And, of course, we all know Bigelow's interest in UFOs, right? Now, whether or not that's coincidence or part of the reason he was initially hired, there's no way to know. But in his conversation, the lieutenant colonel did say that he could not comment any further on the case because of his prior job agreement, with Bigelow Industries. So I thought that was interesting.
That is. So what is the protocol for, like, to say you're investigating this case and you see the person's name that wrote that blog, and you are actually able to get a connection to contact that person? What is a protocol for doing something like that?
Well, I'm myself, I'm somewhat leery on that, right? Because I just hate intruding on someone's private life. The guy who contacted Lieutenant Colonel Kurth, I guess, was not as, it wasn't as big an issue for him. And most of these guys, like, for example, the commanding officer of the F-18 that engaged it, who was Commander David Fravor of the Black Aces, which is the name of his Super Hornet group. I've I was able to determine where he lived, and he had just moved within, I think, a month of when I determined it. And so I sent him a registered letter, certified letter, so it would come back. If it picked up where he had moved to, if he'd done a change of address or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I never received a letter back or a reply. And I just sent a real nice, polite letter. A lot of these guys, after they get out of the military, they work in the defense industry.
Mm-hmm.
And the UFO topic is, when I say it's like the great, I love, the quote, it's the great taboo.
Mm.
It's not like, I don't think it's like someone said, okay, you can't, don't ever talk about UFOs, but it's like if you're in that industry and you do talk about it, it's almost like you're talking about a ghost, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
It's almost like, oh, I saw a ghost this morning. Yeah, I walked right across my living room. I mean, you get the same kind of reaction just about.
I think it's interesting that Bob Bigelow, for one, is not too afraid to talk about it.
No, he's not. Of course, I guess he's the guy that does the hiring, right? So
yeah.
he doesn't have to have any fear about his job. But I think most other guys do have concerns about talking about it. That's a lot of the reason why a lot of the times military guys that talk about it, they've been retired and they're in their 70s or 80s.
Mm-hmm. Right. No one's going to really bother them at this point. So
right.
It's after the hour, and I'm going to put out there that if anyone wants to call in and ask our guest some questions, and you're live and watching on YouTube, you'll see the number underneath in the description. It's 603-967-4030. If you'd like to call in and ask our guest a question. So where do you think this particular case, where do you think it's going to go? Do you think some more people will be engaged eventually in talking about the incident?
Yeah, I think there will be more information that comes out on the case. I was talking to Chris Mellon, and Chris is part of the belongs to the Stars group.
Yeah.
And I've known Chris, I guess, probably 4 years. I have not met him in person, but he's what I consider a fairly conservative person in terms of his views on the UFO phenomenon. So he's pretty down to earth on it. And he indicated to me that they have more information on this particular case. So it will be interesting to see if he has some additional information.
Now, he was in office when this was happening, but I know how compartmentalized everything is. I'm sure he probably never knew anything about it.
Actually, he told me he had heard about it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and he was confident that it had occurred. He didn't know that at that time when I talked to him about this. I first talked to him about the case not too long after I found out in mid-2016.
Mm-hmm.
And he was confident at that point. This is long before the To the Stars group had been formed.
Right.
And at that point in time, he was confident that this had happened. And he was aware of the FOIAs I was going to be sending out. And, he was supportive of all that. But now, he clearly has gotten some more information within the last 6 months. So I suspect that there's someone on their team who had access to additional information on this case.
Now, you hear over, and I think in the chat room we had this happen, people are saying, the Tom DeLonge Nimitz case. How do you think that just happened because it was announced on that, the the broadcast that he did?
Let's see, I'm not sure I understand your question, Mark.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people call this the Tom DeLonge case. Have you? I mean, I've seen that everywhere, and someone mentioned it earlier in the chat room. Oh, that's that video that Tom DeLonge had something to do with. It has really nothing to do with him at all, but it just came out. Chris Mellon, I know, talked about it.
Right, yeah, it really has nothing to do with Tom DeLonge. Chris, had talked about it. Like I said, Chris knew about it, I know, back in 2016. And like I told you, when I found out about it in mid-2016, the individual that told me about it had a lot more information than what's been released, because he had a half-inch file. And he told me things about the case that I haven't seen in the FOIAs, and they're not in anywhere. For example, he indicated to me that the Navy guys were debriefed by, and it was not clear to me if they were debriefed by someone within the Navy or whether they were outside the Navy. And my gut feel was they may have been from outside the Navy.
Mm.
But there's no doubt in my mind that there's more information out there. Just whether or not, this is one of those time will tell.
Right.
And, if the To the Stars groups has more information, then hopefully we'll see something within, a short period of time.
Right. How long did this event go on for?
Well, my understanding is it went on for several days before the actual event on November 14th. That prior to that, there had been, the radar guys were picking it up. So this had been for several days. A couple of other things interesting that happened is both the Marine and the Navy pilots were asked if they had any ordnance on board. And both of them said no, they didn't. So I just thought that's interesting that they would even be asked that.
Ordnance meaning?
Weapons.
Weapons? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. So they were thinking a possible self-defense, it sounds like.
Well, I don't know if it's self-defense or if it was just,
blast them out of the sky.
Yeah, blast. They shouldn't be there.
Yeah. So how far off of the shore did this actually happen?
It was about 70 miles southwest of San Diego.
And that's really kind of curious. It makes you wonder, thinking, well, the Catalina Islands, those are off of L.A., right? I mean, there's really nothing out 70 miles out, just ocean.
Yeah, they were just doing the Carrier Attack Group 11, which is the Nimitz is the main aircraft carrier for that. And so it was involved, the Princeton, there was a submarine, the USS, can't recall if it was the USS Louisville, I think it was the Louisville. But it was not involved in the sighting, it was just part of that carrier group.
Someone I spoke to recently was suggesting that, with all this activity in, toward North Korea out, with all the activity in the Navy vessels, that there's probably, or most likely, it was someone just speculating, that there's probably sightings. And, you do hear about activity during, some type of war or event. It just seems, like there's some type of attraction going on there.
Yeah, this is just kind of from experience. It's not like full of data, but just from everything I've ever done and read and research, and just my experience has been that it seems like if you wanted to attract a UFO sighting, the best way to do it is to have a large military operation. And it just seems to attract because there's there's too many cases in history where, you know, a military training exercise cites UFOs.
Absolutely, yeah, which I think is really fascinating. I've told on this show a number of different times that I talked to someone in Vietnam that said there were sightings. You know, he was part of a, supposedly, according to himself, this was many years ago, he told me, he was part of a special group in the Air Force that was investigating, you know, sightings during a lot of the conflicts. So,
yeah,
it's very puzzling.
A large number of those. There was one, I believe it was in 1964, and it was near where the Aguadilla case happened. It was the USS Gant, and there was a military exercise. It's in Project Blue Book, so these are documented by the Air Force. They even have the object on radar, and the images of the radar are available in Project Blue Book. So there's definitely an object there, and it was cited by both the Air Force and the Navy. And it was just during a naval exercise, which is what this was off of the coast of California, because they were going through exercises because the USS Nimitz the next year was sent to Iraq. So it was, you know, it was out in the, I don't remember if it's in the Mediterranean or in the Persian Gulf, but it went out into that arena.
Now, this is one of the, I don't know what the right term for it is, but it's one of the super carriers or something like that, isn't it?
Yes, it's a nuclear carrier. I believe, if I'm correct, it's the first of the Nimitz-class nuclear attack carriers.
Wow. Back in the late 70s, I was in the San Diego area, and I went out and I was at a park with my girlfriend and was invited with, you know, from these Navy guys that said, hey, come, you know, check out, we're on this carrier, and I can't remember the name of it. I have never seen anything like that in my life. The thing was just like so huge, I just couldn't even imagine it.
Yeah, there's like 5,000 guys on those carriers. It's a small city.
Right. And I remember, you know, they have, you know, we walked by this, I don't want to say building, a compartment, I guess, all set up for a machine shop. He says, we can replace almost anything that breaks in the entire ship right out of here, you know, tool it out, which is fascinating. They're so self-sufficient. And 5,000 people, that's, you know, a small, I mean, not quite a city, but it's a large town.
Yeah.
With the people. And the way they can just scramble the jets so quickly it's fascinating how all that works. Bring them up in the elevators and all that. So are there any other cases, you know, you mentioned earlier the one in Puerto Rico that there was a military operation. Is there other ones, you know, similar to this that you're familiar with?
Well, there's another one I can tell you a little bit about that's a very interesting case. And this one also happened, actually 2013. So it's about the same time frame as the Aguadilla, Puerto Rico case. Except this case happened in Canada. And I found it to be a very interesting case because...
Hey, Robert, would you mind holding that thought just for a minute? We'll get right back to that, and we'll talk about this case. I promise the listener and you, but we have a caller calling in I'd like to take. Okay? Okay, caller, welcome to the show. Your first name and where are you calling from? Can you hear me, caller?
Yes, sir.
Hi there. Your first name, where are you calling from?
I am Ryan. I'm calling from South Carolina.
Oh, Ryan again.
Yes.
Oh,
it's been a couple of weeks.
Yeah, how about that? How you doing, Ryan? You have a question for our guest?
Yes, I do. I hope I didn't call it sounded like y'all were about to get into something, so I hope I didn't call it a bad time.
Remember. We'll get back into it. We're leaving the listener in suspense.
Okay. I just had a quick question. Some of the evidence presented has to do with radar sightings or something like that. I've always wanted to ask a radar expert this with regard to UFOs. How reliable would you consider it? I mean, I've talked to weather people, software people, and they've all said that, relying on radar for UFO sightings might be an issue at times because, there are radar anomalies associated with weather. There are software problems that cause, misinterpretation of the data. What's his opinion on, the possibility of some UFOs being just simply radar anomalies?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ryan. And I know what you're talking about. There, for example, you can have a radar beam that bounces off an inverted atmospheric air layer, right? And so you get what you think is an object, and it's actually just the beam bouncing off a cloud or an inverted area. In this particular case, the one we were talking about, my understanding is that the Spy-1 system, which is what is the name of the radar system that the USS Princeton was using, operates at various radar wavelengths simultaneously. So it's not just a one. It's not like you just send a beam out at 2.4 gigahertz and it comes back. I mean, they're sending out a spread across various wavelengths. So the likelihood that you would get a false return is less. And then if you add to it that this airborne early warning aircraft, he's also detecting the object at the same location. So now that makes it kind of problematic because you've got a Navy ship and you've got an aircraft that are at two different locations. And in order to create a bogey, your bogey is going to have to bounce the beam back incorrectly to both ship and aircraft at the same, XYZ coordinate in the atmosphere. Now, you can do that if you're doing it intentionally, right? Like if you're trying to basically hide, if this is a U.S. For example, I'm pretty sure the U.S. has the ability to make an aircraft show up on someone's radar screen, and so you can intentionally do that, but I don't think that could happen, by accident. And if this is an unknown, right, we just make the assumption that the unknown is not trying to fool the radar systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I have to admit I've always been amazed by some of these radar reports is sometimes the tracked object will be going faster than the plane chasing it. And I just always wondered if they're, playing devil's advocate here, is there a radar anomaly that can produce that? Say we're just chalking it being tracked by one object as opposed to multiple.
Yeah, and I've got a fair amount of experience analyzing radar, but I'm not a radar expert. But from what I do know, I think you would be hard pressed to have a false radar image that's moving in a straight line at a high rate of speed. Mm-hmm. Especially and then it makes a sudden turn. I would expect the radar, the false radar image, to mostly kind of sit there because it's continually bouncing. Now, and it might make a sudden jump, right? Because maybe you're false if you're looking like an inverted atmospheric layer. It might look like it's sitting there, right, because you're bouncing off. And then maybe the atmosphere changes a little bit, so now you don't bounce off that area. The beam goes a little farther and bounces off a different area, so it looks like something jumped someplace. But I don't think you'd see a straight line, in other words, because your radar is usually turning every 3 to 10 seconds. So I don't think you would see something moving, for example, in a straight line if it was what they call, I guess they call those a radar rabbit, I think.
All right. Well, hey, Ryan, thanks for the call.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
So just along those lines, before we get back into the story, in 1952, with the sightings over the Capitol and in Washington, D.C., I believe they tried to debunk that, or, I don't want to say debunk, but they tried to come up with an explanation of the radar, and they said that it was inversions, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think that was the explanation for the 1952 sightings. The thing to me that makes that one less likely is that you have a visual sighting along with the radar sighting.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's probably your strongest type of sightings when you have visual and radar.
Yeah, I agree.
Like the RB-47 case back in 1957. Not only was there radar from the RB-47, but there was radar on the ground detecting the object, and there was a visual sighting of the object.
Yeah. So I interrupted you in the middle of a story, and I always get, well, I got to say it, I always get hate mail when I do that. So, so I'm expecting that. But do you remember approximately where you left off in the story?
Sure.
Okay, great.
So this story is 3 hunters. They're hunting black bear up in Ontario, and they're in the middle of nowhere. There's no cell phone towers. There's nothing. They're on an old logging road. So they're headed down to this logging road. They set up their sites for where they're going to hunt the black bear. It's about, I think, around 5, 6 o'clock. They shoot some black bear. They video it. And then they call on the radio to the other hunters, because there's several groups of hunters out on this area, but there are 3 right here. So they call and say, hey, we've got ours. And so they're getting ready to pack up and go meet the other hunters. So they put the black bear in the back of the pickup truck, and they're driving down the road. By now it's about 9 o'clock at night, and it's dark. And there's nothing anywhere. So there's no lights other than the lights from the pickup truck. You got 2 guys in the front of the truck, 1 guy in the back. The guy in the back happens to be a research and development scientist that has contracts with the DOD. That's what really excited me about this case. So we've got a guy who's got a good head on his shoulders, and he's sitting in the back of this pickup, and they're going down this logging road, and he sees these lights approaching. And he told me his first thought was, why would a helicopter, because these things are moving slow, right? It's low altitude. What's a helicopter doing out here in the middle of nowhere at 9:30 at night? So he's not feeling real good about this, because there's no reason you'd have a helicopter out there. So they're continuing down the logging road, and the lights continue in their direction until the lights is right in front. It's starting to cross the road in front of them. It's about 400 yards away at that point in time. And he tells the driver, he says, stop the truck and turn off your lights. So he does that, and by now the object is close enough to them. It's about 200 yards at this point in time. And he can tell this is no helicopter. And it's shaped like a barbell. It's like you took a disc, your typical flying saucer disc on one side of the barbell and put one on the other side of the barbell, and it's just sitting there in the sky. And the first thing he does is he grabs his camera that he videoed the black bear with, right? And so he turns it on. As soon as he turns it on for about 1 second, it turns right back off.
Battery dies.
He clicks it on. Yeah. Turns it on, turns right off. So then he grabs his cell phone to use that camera. Well, his cell phone, he said, is hot, and it's acting as if someone had just rebooted it. So it's not it's not live. So now he doesn't have, he looks for the next thing he can do. He has his hunting rifle, which has a 9x 50 millimeter scope on his hunting rifle. So he gets out of the truck and he holds the hunting rifle on the hood, and he's basically just watching and everything this object's doing. So that your audience can visualize this. Imagine the barbell, and it's got a plasma that's about 12 inches all the way around it, kind of an indigo-colored plasma. And the object is slowly spinning around its center. By slowly, I mean very slowly, like once a minute. It completes revolution. And there's a stream. He described it as being similar to the aurora borealis coming out of the object, but it never reaches the ground. It just kind of stops. And the streams of particles basically are opposite of the direction of movement of the object. So it's not like, like in a jet, right, your gases come out of the nozzles. Instead, these particles just come out of opposite of wherever the object's moving. It has nothing to do with any particular, like a jet engine or anything like that. And so as he's watching it, the guy in the front goes, "Shoot it!"
Jeez.
And he's like, "No, I'm not going to shoot something. I don't even know what it is." So he continues taking mental notes, and then this object starts to move again, and it slowly moves off. And by the time it's about a quarter mile away, which is about I think that's roughly around 500 yards or so, he picks up his camera again to see if maybe it will work this time, because it was, turn on for a minute, turn off.
Right.
Well, this time he turns it on, and it's working. And so he thinks he's videoing the object, and he videos it, and then, the object disappears. So then, after it's gone, he replays his video. Well, during the 3 minutes of his video that he videoed the object, all you can hear are their voices, and you can't see anything.
Oh.
It's just noise. So,
wow.
So this guy, he became. He's got several dozen patents on his business, and my first thought when I heard his story was, this is pretty interesting. I want to meet the guy in person. So I flew up to where the guy lived, and I met with him. And I had already verified that he did have these patents, and these are projects he does with the Department of Defense. And I saw his operation. He even took me to a Department of Defense plant where he said, "Okay, Robert, to get you in here, I'm going to tell them that I'm interviewing you for a job." So I gave them my driver's license, and they signed me in. And we just went through there, and he just showed me the different products he had that they were manufacturing this Defense Department plant. And this plant was a full acre indoors.
Wow.
Of just everything from submarine buoys to lasers to, what have you. And they weren't just making his products. They were making products from a lot of different people that had, And so he was just showing me this. And then when I went to it, he had 5 engineers that worked for him. He had his own research building. He had a very expensive car inside there, and the guy clearly has plenty of money. So to me, Martin, it was like, okay, so why would this guy make this? This is one of these stories, right? Because I've got a very credible witness. I mean, I've got a guy with a science background that saw this, and it's up close. So you're left with only really two hypotheses. Either one, it happened, or two, the guy's lying. You know, it's kind of hard to believe it was a mass hallucination of him and the other two hunters. And we interviewed one of the other hunters on video, and we interviewed this guy too, but we had to black out their face and their voices because he does not want his name or identity known, because he has people that he employs, and he doesn't want to take the risk of losing his, DOD contracts over something like this.
Did he actually say in the video, in the interview, did he actually say that he did contract work for the DOD or not?
I believe he did. I'd have to go look at the video again. I think he does say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he did, because I went to his plant and I saw the work he was doing, and I went to the DOD facility. So there's no doubt that he does. So the question just becomes, okay, why would this guy make up the story, right? I mean, some people might say, oh, he's a government plant, right? They're trying to pull your leg, right? Like, there's no reason this guy would do that. And there's no reason the government really would do that, because if you think about it, ufology is its best worst enemy. The government doesn't have to do anything to kill it.
I know. The Roswell slides. You could go on and on.
Yeah.
How did you first hear about? Did he report the story to one of the UFO centers, or how did you hear about the story to begin with?
Okay, so this guy reported the story into Mufon, and the guy that went and investigated the story was an ex-policeman, and the ex-policeman, who was a Mufon field investigator, contacted me because he just asked around, hey, who can I have help me out on this case? So this guy was open-minded enough to say, hey, let me get some help on this. So he and I talked about it. He met with the witness at least 2 to 3 times, and then I flew up to meet with the witness. And I just wanted to try to figure out, okay, what is the motivation here? And I could not see any motivation for him to make this story up.
Yeah.
Because it's not like he's remaining anonymous, so he can't make money from it, and he doesn't need money because he has plenty of money. There's just no reason for him to make it up. Now, one thing I could tell from it, Martin, is he is very, I guess you might say, transfixed with what happened now. I mean, he's really wanting to, okay, how can I figure this out? I mean, he's had his own engineers work on models of how could this happen. And for example, where his video didn't work in his telephone, he doesn't jump to the conclusion, that ship didn't want me to video it, so it, wiped out my phone. That's not the way he looked at it at all. He said, okay, hey, I've got a plasma that's 12 inches around this object. That takes a lot of power. So he had his engineers calculate how much power would it take to create an indigo plasma in the atmosphere, and he made the assumption that the frequency of the plasma was the same as you can make the color indigo with an electrical arcs. And I don't recall the frequency. I'd have to go look it up. So what he did is he had his engineer say, okay, that's the frequency it's at. How much power would it take to basically turn 12 inches of atmosphere all around this craft into a plasma? And the answer they came back with was basically the same amount of power as a small nuclear power plant would produce.
Wow.
And so from there he said, okay, well, if I got that much power, the EM field from it is going to be so strong that my camera's not going to work, nor will my cell phone work. So he believes that was just an artifact of the field around the craft, and he thinks that's why once it went farther away and he turned his camera back on, that he was able to get the audio, but he wasn't able to get the video.
Oh, it still had some effect on it.
Yeah, it still had effect on it.
So now, when you're talking about that strong of a signal, could that be detrimental to your health or plant and animal health?
Well, it could be if you're exposed to it for a significant, long enough period of time, but they were just, it wasn't a real long exposure.
I see.
And it was, 400 or 500 feet away from them. So, basically it was just enough of an EM field to probably, he and I talked, and this is best guess, is that probably it was a Sony, I can't even remember the brand. It was one of the Sony cameras, and it probably has a safety feature to keep from a camera being destroyed. So it probably says, okay, if I pick up more than X amount of current in my in my circuitry, then I just turn on. Then you have a breaker or something similar to that cuts off the unit so that you don't damage it.
Right.
So that's what he thinks probably happened, and probably the same thing with the cell phone. And they also had Motorola radios that they used to communicate because there's no cell phone towers in that area. And their Motorola radio units were fried. Those didn't survive.
Wow, that's amazing. So when this was happening, did he hear any type of sound or anything? Do you talk about that?
No, he could not hear any sound. However, he took, when I was visiting him, he's got his camera. It's locked up in a safe. And so he had his camera, and we hooked it up to an oscilloscope. And he basically feels that there is a real low-level sound that's being generated that's picked up on the video camera. But it wasn't a sound that he didn't notice it when he was out there.
When you talk to someone, I love talking to people where an event happens to, and, they're not really, they never had an interest in the field at all. And they take it serious, and, what is it? All that. I love it. Does he now wonder, about if it was, say, extraterrestrial? Is he thinking all those different thoughts?
Yeah, his first thing he thought about was, okay, is this something that we have?
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
And because he's got, DOD contacts, he asked them, hey, is there anything we have like this? Because he and I talked about that.
Yeah.
And he said the one guy he knows basically gave him an answer. He said, the guy told him, if we had something like this, I wouldn't give you an answer one way or another. And the only thing I can tell you is I don't know anything about it. So basically the guy was telling him that they don't have anything like that, which I think he already suspected, right? Because you can't, we just don't have the ability to take a heavy, large object and to let it just sit there without moving, unless it's a balloon, unless it's lighter than the air, or unless it's like a helicopter, right? But not an object that makes no noise and is heavy and large and it just sits there. It's just not something we can do.
Right. Yeah, I find sightings like that fascinating, and I have somehow either read something, because I do recall seeing a graphic that almost looked like a barbell, unless it was another UFO sighting.
Yeah, he actually had his engineers make a really neat graphic that you can, it's a PDF, and you can actually spin it. By spin it, I mean you can, on your computer, you can turn it, you can make it look at you face on. It's a 3D CAD drawing, basically, and you can just turn the object any way you want, and you see it from all different frames.
All right, going back to UFO data, we were talking about that earlier. What happens in a situation like this when there is plasma and you have a unit you're trying to collect data with? Does the same thing happen? It either will fry it or it'll, not work?
Yeah, I mean, if let's just say there had been a UFO data system there, like the one that they've developed a model that will take a spectrograph. What would have happened, because it's a battery-operated DSLR camera system, so it's very similar to it will do video, right? And it would have shut down also, just like his did.
That must be so frustrating. So many cases you hear about, the car stalls, the cameras happens a lot, where a battery looks like it just dies when it was fully charged. And it must all, be related to, the same propulsion system or something, whatever it is. All fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I would like to have done if the resources were available, right, which the resources are there if there was a government organization to do it, right, because you've got a known camera model. It was a Sony Cybershot, and we know the exact model, right? And so all you need is the design engineers to tell you, okay, how does the shutdown mechanism work on that camera?
Mm-hmm.
And then you would just model, okay, what kind of frequencies would shut it down, and at what power levels? And then the same thing with the cell phone, right? And then you look at where they intersect. In other words, what power level and what frequency would basically cause the cell phone to basically turn off and restart up again, cause the camera to shut down within a second of being turned on, and cause the Motorola field radios to fry, and the truck engine is unaffected.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about. I was going to ask you about the truck. So nothing at all happened with the truck.
Right. The truck, the engine. They turned off the lights, but the engine was not, did not cut or die.
Wow, that is just so baffling. It seems like it's some type of frequency somewhere in between. But the car computers today are so complicated. It seems like it would somehow affect that.
Yeah, you would think that it would, but then I'm not an electrical engineer, so I don't know how current cars and trucks are designed in terms of how susceptible are they to EM fields.
So we have we're coming up at the top of the hour, but I'm going to go a little longer because of the technical issues that we had. If that's okay with you,
Sure.
Another 5 or so after. What do you think what's your best, the only thing I can ask is, what's your best guess on, I think you understand that, something's happening. So I'm going to ask you what your best guess is to what it could be.
Okay, so that's a good question, Martin. Here's you're basically asking me what's my view of the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah.
And okay, so this is my answer based on 10 years of studying it, and I probably average 15 hours a week working on it.
Wow.
In my mind, there's no doubt that it physically exists, right? In other words, I'm saying the UFO phenomenon is not just light from the sky. It's an actual physical object, and as far as I can tell, it appears to be intelligently controlled. So I feel pretty confident that it's intelligently controlled. Now, what is it, and where does it come from? There's no way to really know that, right? I mean, there's no way to know from where does it originate. Now, I can give my best hypothesis, right, which is just a guess based on the facts and information that we have. If I had to guess, I would say it probably was extraterrestrial.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is it's more than one extraterrestrial source, just because there's so many different shapes and capabilities, and over time, right? This started right after World War II, or actually during World War II. And in the beginning, it was dominated by the disc shape. And today, I would say, well, I won't. It's not that I would say. I've actually looked at it, and it's now dominated by the triangle shape.
I know. The new model.
So, right, that's changed, over time. And the characteristics, right, back in the 70s and 80s, it was 60s and 70s, it was very common for automobiles to just suddenly die, right, when they were in the presence of one of these UFOs. Well, that rarely, there's a few cases, but it rarely happens today. So, and maybe that's because of the way we've changed the design of the car when we went from the old-fashioned distributor system, which was a spark ignition system, to the modern one, which is computer control. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But a lot of things in the phenomena have changed. So I think the best bet's extraterrestrial. And to me, if you argue it not from the UFOs people see here, but just forget that for a minute and just look at all the extrasolar planets that we see, right? I mean, we've now cataloged over 3,000 extrasolar planets.
Mm-hmm.
And a good number of those are in the habitable zones. And if you ask, for example, some of the scientists in SETI about extraterrestrial life, they will readily admit that intelligent extraterrestrial life exists out there. I mean, that's why they're doing the work they're doing, because they believe it exists.
Mm-hmm.
So they're fine telling you that there's life that exists. And if you ask them, well, is some of that life much more intelligent than us? They will say yes. Some of it's got to be more intelligent than us. So then you ask the next question. Do they know we're here? And now you may get different answers from them. But to me, the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason is, just look at what we've done in the last 20 years.
Absolutely.
Where we've gone from 0 extrasolar planets to we've now cataloged over 4,000. I would say we're within 20 years of being able to identify the chemical species in the atmosphere of some of these planets.
That's right.
So you can imagine a civilization hundreds of years more advanced than us. They've already realized that there's a planet going around our sun, planet Earth, that has oxygen, nitrogen in its atmosphere. They may even be able to detect that when it's not facing the sun, there's a certain frequencies of light that seems to dominate across the land masses, right? All that light we emit.
Mm-hmm.
And then they may even be able to detect isotopes of uranium and plutonium in our atmosphere, because those still exist from our above-ground bombings from the 50s and 60s. So you've got strontium isotopes, uranium, plutonium. And so they could look at that and they could go, okay, there's someone that lives there that has the capability of doing nuclear fission and fusion. Now, whether they still exist, they may not know. So the only question becomes, can they get here?
Right? And that's where science becomes very closed-minded. And I think it's just that just because we don't have the physics of that figured out yet, doesn't mean that it can't be out there and it can't be figured out.
Right, but it's becoming a little more open-minded. I went to a conference in Huntsville only, I guess it was 3 or 4 months ago. And you know what this conference was about? How could we get a small spacecraft to Alpha Centauri, which is 4 light years away, within 20 years? Get it there. And you know who was at this conference? NASA, the U.S. Air Force, a large number of major universities that, you know, do research for the Air Force. And the basic concept was, I mean, it's technically possible for us to actually send a very small spacecraft to Alpha Centauri, which we know there's a planet there in the habitable zone of Alpha Centauri, and get it there in 20 years. And the basic idea was to use a huge bank of laser systems on the Earth or on the Moon, and to use those lasers to accelerate an object that's basically, I don't know, probably an ounce in weight or less. Is this the sail thing? Well, this is not I guess you might call it a sail. You basically hit this sail, and you accelerate it to 20% of the speed of light. Mm-hmm. And they've done the calculations. It was going to take, in 11 minutes, it would be at 20% of the speed of light. Wow. But the key here is the weight. The weight is almost nothing. You're basically taking a silicon chip and the ability to take photographs and, you know, just do a few basic measurements like your cell phone can do. And that becomes your spacecraft. And in 20 years, they could get it to Alpha Centauri. Now, they couldn't get it to slow down, so it's going to be like flying through their solar system and just snapping pictures as it goes by and then sending them back, and that would be it. But the point there is that we're already starting to think about that. So where would a civilization that's hundreds of years more advanced than us be? Right. Just a thought on that. Now, does weight actually, this is just from a lay person here, does weight really matter in space for travel? The mass does. Okay. So the mass of the object makes the difference. So, because basically the photon has almost as close to zero mass, and it's traveling at the speed of light, and you're basically trying to get some amount of mass to travel close to the speed of light by hitting it with these photons and imparting that energy to the mass. Oh, wow. Okay, so in closing here, just one thing, and I'm not sure if this is still something that's active or not, but I do remember that I got an email from you, I don't know, maybe a couple of months ago, that you were trying to do a call of action going back to the Nimitz. Are you still, is that still ongoing? Yes, we're trying to get everyone to send their congressman a letter asking for Congress to investigate this incident. You know, to basically ask the Navy to give Congress a debriefing on what happened. That's great. And where can someone find that? I mean, I saw a link to that on Open Minds. It's probably still there. Yes, there's a link on Open Minds. And if they go to Facebook, and if they just look on Facebook for the word SCU, Scientific Coalition for Ufology, if they'll put that in, they'll find the SCU Facebook site, and on there are plenty of instructions that tell them how to find. They can actually click on links that tell them who their congressman is. I've got a letter template that they can download and print out and send to their congressman. So just go to Facebook and search for the word Scientific Coalition for Ufology, and you'll find everything you need there. Excellent. Robert, as always, it's such a pleasure. Well, thanks, Martin. It was an interesting talk.
Yes, and I'm sorry we had a little bit of technical difficulty, but we made it through. All right. So you take care.
Thanks. Have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye now. Okay, everyone. So thank you so much for hanging in with us. And we're going to be back next week with Peter Davenport. He's always a great guest to have on. And so that's it for tonight. I want to thank the people that helped out with the show, Alejandro Rojas, our guests, Peggy for managing our Facebook page. There's 23,000, I think, people on our Facebook page, and some activity going on there. She's always posting UFO updates on that and science-related things, so check that out. And again, I want to thank you all for listening, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.